This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
First of all, I would like to say that my presentation will be limited to STEAM, which is rules and constraints of artistic creation, the neurobiologist viewpoint. And the first slides I will show is just to simply illustrate that there is indeed a genetic envelope to the origin of art and aesthetics in the human lineage. And one of the first steps, of course, is the discovery of tools, which take place with Homo habilis about 2.5 million years ago. The brain at this stage was only 600 cubic millimeter. And the second step, if I may say, is the discovery of symmetry. Since you may have noticed that the first tools were rather rough and without very definite shape, and with Homo erectus 1.5 million years ago, and with a brain of 800 cubic millimeter, symmetry is indeed present with these bifas, which were collected here in Ethiopia. Now, another step, which is important, is the discovery of symbolism with Homo heidelbergensis 300,000 years ago. The brain now is significantly larger, approaching that of Homo sapiens sapiens. And these were found in Aven sepulchral in Spain. And one can notice funerary settings and funerary offerings. And last but not least, of course, is the discovery of artistic composition, which is appearing 100,000 years ago with Homo sapiens, and a brain of 1,400 cubic millimeter, which is the volume, approximative volume of our brain. So there is clearly some kind of genetic envelope for the evolutionary origins of art. And perhaps as a next stage in my presentation, I would like to try to define what is art and aesthetics. And the first point I would like to underline is that work of art is human production, some kind of artifact, which I view as specialized for intersubjective communication, to use symbolic forms, which could either be genetically or epigenetically, it means learned, encoded. And second, it's clear that works of art do not belong to language as such. It's a non-verbal communication, primarily of emotional states, knowledge, experience, with a diversity of codes at variance with language. Yet there are constraints, rules, what in French one may call the règles de l'art, and I will try to define what they are in the second part of my presentation. And what is seemingly one of the most characteristic features of works of art is where they have some kind of aesthetic efficacy, staggering effects that we have to further define on emotion and reason as well, which mobilize both conscious and non-conscious processes. And last but not least, art is in constant evolution. There is indeed an art history, And having seen the Grotte Chauvet as the first slide, you may question, is there any progress in art or simply an adaptative renewal that one may see throughout the years since these early origins of art. But we shall have, of course, we are fortunate enough to have paleoanthropologists among us who are going to tell us what are the first creation in art of human beings. Now, just to be more biologist and neurobiologist, I would like to say that, of course, artistic creation is done by our brains and the brains of our ancestors. And I would like to say that from the outset that we may view it as a synthesis of multiple nested evolutionary processes. Of course, those I just mentioned at the gene level, but also other processes which are taking place during brain development. And one may emphasize the fact that the human brain takes 15 years at least to develop and fully develop through postnatal synaptic epigenesis. So there is a nested epigenetic evolution within the genetic evolution, of course, at a different time scale. But we have also, as you know, change of synaptic efficacies which are taking place at the level of our brain connections in the time scale of hundreds of milliseconds to seconds. And these are linked, of course, to the mental or psychological times for thinking and creating. And in addition to this kind of fast evolution, there is, in addition, of course, the cultural and social evolution, which is taking place at a much larger scale and most likely involve extracerebral memories like the works of arts. Now, having these ideas in mind, I will say two things mainly. Make 2 points. First, how does the processing of the visual image is taking place? I am only speaking here about visual arts, but of course there are other arts like music and so on. And then in the second part of this brief presentation, I will discuss the rules of art to further define what may be called a work of art. And as you may imagine, of course, there is a bottom-up processing of the visual image from our retina through our visual system, cortex, primary and secondary cortical area, and then parietal and temporal cortical areas for the perception of movement, of death, spatial organization, and ground figure segregation from the dorsal pathway, and the recognition of objects, recognition of faces, perception of colors through ventral pathway. Now, all these processes are meeting at the level of the prefrontal cortex, and throughout this processing of piece of art, there is, of course, an evocation of stored images and emotions, and therefore a very strong impression of emotion taking place during this processing. And there is, of course, as you know, a system devoted for this emotion processing, which is the limbic system, and Antonio Damasio is going to talk about this. And what I would like to say is that it is interesting to view these final steps in the processing of the visual image as taking place through a very rich interconnection between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And that's where I believe, this is an hypothesis, of course, I wish to propose, that aesthetic efficacy is due to the access to consciousness of these images and emotion which have been processed non-consciously beforehand and have a non-access to space, which I call the global neuronal workspace, which might originate, and this is our hypothesis, from a set of long axon neurons which are heavily interconnected and are using, are broadcasting signals to multiple areas and yield the subjective experience of what may be called the artistic contemplation. This notion of global neuronal workspace has been developed with Stanislas Dehaene during the past decade, and as I said, is based on the occurrence of these sets of long-range connections which interconnect the prefrontal, the parieto-temporal, and cingulate cortex. And you can see this old slide of MacLean that already emphasized the relationship between the limbic and the prefrontal cortex. And the proposal here, which is again a hypothesis to further discuss, there is some kind of discrete mental synthesis which of multiple parallel and distributed processes, which is going to take place at this level and give what I would call this aesthetic experience. Now you can see this image and ask, was it a man's face or a woman? Answer? Well, and this is simply that one of these images having access to consciousness. And this is just to illustrate that one can, in fact, now have an objective investigation on access to consciousness through this kind of experiment, where here this set of slides are shown to the subject. Here, when one asks the subject, have you seen something? He said, yes, lion. If now you have the same slides, but the order is different, the masks are in between note, then the subject does not report anything subjectively viewed. So this is visible, and here it is not visible, but consciously, non-consciously processed by the brain. Now, if you look at the brain images, which were again obtained by Stanislas Dehaene and colleagues, you can realize that, in fact, for conscious processing, you have indeed the mobilization of the prefrontal cortical areas, but this is not taking place to the same extent in the case of non-conscious processing. So why not to view the aesthetic experience as being precisely the conscious access to the global workspace? This is the hypothesis I simply wish to put forward. Now, I would like to close on other issues. Work of art is not simply a clock or a bottle of wine or landscapes. There is something more in the definition of a work of art, and I think to introduce this notion, I would like to quote a statement by Braque, "J'aime la règle qui corrige l'émotion." In English, it is, "I love the rule which corrects the emotion." And I think this is a very profound statement for us, since indeed our brain is so complex and there are so many interconnections that everything is possible. Our brain might even explode if, I would say, under the possibilities of combinations which are possibly established between nerve cells. And therefore, what is characteristic of a piece of art is that there is indeed a restriction of these possible combinations. And that's what I call an efficient rule, which is most often implicit in the case of the artist, which restricts in the top-down manner the number of possible representations, which creates what I would call the style of the artist. And these rules may be viewed, but this is still something to investigate. Again, it's the program for future research. A quite pattern of connections, some kind of scaffoldings, which would be stored in long-term memory and constrain the artist's gesture. So what are these rules? Of course, first of all, you are not going to forgive an artist to repeat himself or to repeat the work of somebody else. So novelty is one of the rules, the constant search for the unanticipated. Now, this is not sufficient, of course, but you may have neural basis for novelty with this brain imaging of surprise, where indeed you can see the prefrontal cortex is activated. This is from the work of Reichel and Posner. When you are used to see something, then you get bored or desensitized, and the prefrontal cortex is becoming silent, or not completely silent, but at least there is less activity. And now if you show a novel piece of art, then there is reactivation of this prefrontal cortex. So there is indeed some kind of neural basis for novelty or surprise. Now, this is not sufficient, of course. And another characteristic of what may be defined as a piece of art is what I called consensus spartium, following, of course, Alberti at the Renaissance, who get this definition, which is the universal search for harmony. This is not a Platonician kind of principle. It is something which I consider as being neurally based. And this is what may be called the coherence of the parts within the whole. And just to illustrate this point, I would like to show the photographs of the work which preceded, anticipated this beautiful painting of Matisse in Baltimore Museum. And here are a few of the steps, and they are all by Matisse himself, of course. And you can see where he started, and when you compare where he started to how he finished, you may say, well, I could not believe that this is by Matisse, but yet it was from Matisse. And then he progressively, through this tedious work, finally reached this stage that he considered as final, and where all the parts were indeed consistent with the whole. Now, is there a neural basis for that? Well, there are few experiments along these lines, and these are from the group of Kramann from Germany, where the subject has to compare a picture which is symmetrical with another one which is non-symmetrical and supposed to be beautiful. So this is, I wish to ask your forgiveness, something very, very crude and primitive as a test for beauty. But this can be improved, of course. Yet you can see that there is a very striking difference between what may be called aesthetic judgment from symmetry judgment. And again, these prefrontal temporal, parieto-temporal networks of these long-range connections are being mobilized in the aesthetic judgment. Now, there is also something else, and the list is not closed for the artist, is to convey a message. When we see these lions from Grotte Chauvet, they had a significance, for sure. So there is something that the artist had to convey to the public, to the spectator. And I would use the word of Poussin, exemplum, what the artist wants the spectator to share with him his conception of the world. And I just want to illustrate this aspect with these beautiful paintings from Pablo Picasso of the Minotaur. And I would say that an important function of art is to make us aware. And is there a neural basis for that? I think there is, of course. There are a lot of studies being done now about empathy. And here is the comparison of the brain images which are obtained by a person who suffers from electrical stimulus, and another one which sees the person suffering from the electrical stimulus. And you can see that there are many circuits which are in common, others are different. And there are, we may see that there are indeed neural circuits of empathy. And my conclusion would be that art makes us aware of oneself as another. Now I am finishing. This is my next to last slide with another rule which I may consider as important as well, which is schematization. And just to raise a question for the paleoanthropologists who are going to speak after me. This is from Grotte Chauvet, and you have these dots and you have this horse. What about realism and abstraction? This is, as you know, a very important issue in even contemporary art. But I would like to quote Herbert Simon, who said the beauty of a scientific proposition lies in the fact that it explains much from little. And I leave you with this statement. Now, to conclude, I would say that we have to further discuss, and I am not going to talk about this, the evolutionary origins of art and aesthetics in the framework of Darwinian evolution, sexual selection, group selection, intersubjective communication, social bonding, or even simply a byproduct of brain evolution. Thank you very much. And I want to just say that I wish to acknowledge not only the Institut Pasteur and Collège de France, but you see this Casque School of Pharmacy and Palmer Taylor for being my host, and of course CARTA and Ajit Varkin and the Kavli Foundation. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to talk about the what Samir has called neuroaesthetics, and many of us have been interested in the question of, can you come up with science of art? Now this seems like an oxymoron because science and art seem fundamentally antithetical enterprises. Art is about asserting individuality to every human being. Science is about discovering universal principles. In fact, C.P. Snow, a long time ago, talked about this two cultures. Science on the one hand, the humanities on the other, and never the twain shall meet. But in fact, I will argue, and most of you will agree, that the place where they meet is in the human brain. And art is a good place to start exploring this possibility. So the question is there a science of art? Well, first of all, let me tell you a little bit, maybe a couple of minutes, on why I got into this. Mainly, I do behavioral neurology and study human vision and visual perception. How come I started investigating visual aesthetics? In fact, until about 10 years ago, I had no interest in art other than, you know, I'd look at pretty pictures, obviously. Or when I went to a conference at some city, I would say, is there an exhibition at the local art gallery? Then I would go to it just to show I was very cultured and, you know, that sort of thing. But I really had no great passion for it. And all that changed about, I don't know, about 12, 13 years ago when I took a course by an art historian, Julia Kindy, who used to be at UCSD. And then I went back to India on a sabbatical, and I didn't have a lot to do. And I kept going to the temples where I would be taken as a child to look at the Indian statues of gods and goddesses. And at that time, it was just religious iconography. And then when I came to England, I was taught that this is all religious iconography, not really high art. So I started thinking about this. They started haunting me day and night, these images, not as religion, but as works of great works of art. And I started wondering, why would some works of art have such powerful effects on the human mind? And I started looking at the history of reactions to Indian art. And when the Victorians first came to India and looked at some of these sculptures, for example, this is a goddess Parvati, who's supposed to be the very epitome, she's supposed to be the goddess of the cosmos, the very epitome of human femininity, sensuality, grace, poise, dignity, everything that makes a woman beautiful. But the Western art historians looked at it and they said, my God, it's hideous. Its breasts are too big, the waist is too narrow, the hips are too big. It doesn't look like a real woman. And of course, by saying this, they are completely missing the point of art, because the point of art is not to create a realistic picture of a woman. You know, you can take a $5 camera and aim it at somebody and create a realistic picture. On the contrary, the goal of art is to deliberately exaggerate, alter, deliberate hyperbole, alter, distort even the image in some way to produce pleasing effects in the human brain. And the question is, are there any lawful aspects to this distortion? Now, the irony is the same English historians, a few centuries later, of course, Picasso comes along, and he creates these nudes, which are grotesquely distorted, 2 eyes on one side of the face like a flounder, and she's got a hunchback, and all of that. And they said, what did the historians say? They said, my God, what a genius. He's liberated us from the tyranny of realism, okay? Well, that's what the Indian artist was doing too. And then I was giving this talk at the Getty about 10 years ago, and some historian of the, I think he was English, in the audience got up and said, well, look, when Picasso was doing it, it was quite deliberate. He was deliberately distorting it. Whereas when the Indian artist was doing, how do you know, maybe he just got it wrong? Well, and I said, well, look, chap, my dear chap, you know, the Indian artist knows perfectly well what realism is. In fact, if you go back 2,500 BC and look at the terracottas in the Indus Valley, it's a wonderfully realistic torso there made of terracotta. In fact, if you look at that bulging belly there, you see it's more realistic than Greek art. That's what real guys look like. You know. But then very quickly they made the transition and they said, to hell with realism, let's create these things. And I'll get back to that in a minute. So the question I'm going to address is another example from Khajuraho showing the, again, completely non-realistic, but conveying the mood of amorous intimacy. So the question I'm going to address is, are there artistic universals? This was raised repeatedly during this meeting. And how does the brain respond to art? And I'm going to urge that, in fact, in spite of the staggering diversity of artistic styles, you see across cultures and across time. You get Tibetan art, you get Chinese art, you get Renaissance art, you get Greek art, you got Roman art, you get Etruscan art, of course Indian art, and you get Dada, which is not even art. But in spite of all this variety, are there some universal underlying principles? And I'd like to argue, yes, in fact, there are. And sitting in the precincts of the temple, I just thought about it, and I came up with what I call the 8 universal laws of aesthetics. And at this point, and I'll get back to these as we go along, and I'm going to tell you about each of these laws. But I want to say, when I say there are universal laws of art, this doesn't mean that there are no cultural overtones to art. Obviously, culture plays a tremendous role. Otherwise, you would not have different artistic styles. But culture and cultural influences are studied ad nauseum by art historians. Not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in, are there universal principles that cut across cultural disciplines? And in fact, I think there are, because look, they even cut across phylogenetic lines. Why would you find a butterfly or a bird of paradise beautiful? A butterfly evolved to be beautiful to another butterfly, not to look beautiful to your brain, right? And yet you, after 600 millions of evolution, find a butterfly beautiful. And I think it's because both organisms are independently evolved, similar aesthetic laws or principles. And of course, some of these include symmetry, which I'll get to in a minute. And just to emphasize this, that art not only transcends cultural boundaries, but species boundaries. Bowerbirds, these are diminutive little nondescript male birds which create this beautiful, incredibly elegant bowers, symmetrical, about 20, 30 times as tall as the bird, decorated with similar colors here. Sometimes they put cigarette foil and berries, and that's another bower, okay? So if you took this and put it in a New York, Manhattan art gallery on Fifth Avenue and didn't tell somebody it was a bird brain that produced it, it might fetch a fairly handsome sum of money. And by the way, you may say, well, it's not really creating it. It doesn't have aesthetic appeal. Well, guess what? If you remove one berry and throw it away, the bird will come back, take the berry, and put it back. Okay? So it's extremely, you can see OCD traits here. Extremely fastidious about it. And every bower is different. The same species, different males produce, it's sort of like a Freudian compensation for their drab appearance. They produce these beautiful bachelor pads, and every bird is slightly different, and this leads to, of course, sexual selection for the most beautiful bower. Okay, so that's another example of a bower where the guy has chosen all these little pebbles of similar color and little blue pebbles in there, and again, a bower that looks different. Now, this doesn't mean culture doesn't play a role. Obviously it does, but it's not something that interests me, right? If it didn't play a role, you can't put that and get $300 million in an art gallery in New York. I'm not making this up. This is Damien Hirst. He has a shark pickled in formaldehyde, and he sells it for $300 million. This is why I avoid the word art. I've started to avoid the word art because of all the cultural connotations. It's a loaded word determined by the auctioneer's hammer, be determined by fads and fashions and culture. I prefer the word visual aesthetics, and I think you can get to the universal principles underlying aesthetics, but not visual art, not yet, okay? Another example, this sold for $500 million. It's a skull decorated with little beads and some diamonds that are thrown in. Okay, I don't know why that would sell for $500 million. That's a Khajuraho Indian sculpture from the 12th century, showing a beautiful, voluptuous celestial nymph, and that sold only for $200,000, by the way. Okay, let's go back to the laws of art. I call them laws of art, but they should be, strike that out with a red pen and say laws of aesthetics. Forget about art, okay? Let me give you a good example of this. I'm going to take you through these step by step and give you very simple examples. In fact, almost too simple. One is grouping or binding. But to understand these principles, let me just briefly say, you have to, there are many people here who are not specialists, so I'll briefly mention the fact that when people think of visual perception, you think there's a picture in the eyeball on the retina, and the picture is transmitted along the optic nerve and displayed on a screen in the brain called the visual cortex. I mean, of course, that's rubbish, because if you have a screen there, then you need another little guy there. And of course, that doesn't solve the problem, because then you need another little guy in his head, and it goes on and on and on. So you have to think in terms of, that shows you a cartoon diagram. There is no screen in the brain with people watching it. So you have to think in terms of symbolic descriptions or transforms, and in fact, well, I can show you examples to illustrate this, but I'm going to skip that. That cube can be either seen as that or that, and it kind of flips mentally, even though I'm not doing anything to the stimulus, which means every act of perception involves judgment by the observer. It involves making a choice, making a decision, using ambiguous inputs, and therefore, we have evolved, another example there, dozens, in fact 30 visual areas in the human brain concerned exclusively or primarily with visual processing. So if it were the case that you're just sending a picture to the brain and then looking at the picture, you don't need 30 areas. The reason you need 30 areas is it turns out vision is an extraordinarily complex and sophisticated process. So what I'd like to submit is, and this is good news for artists, because if vision involved just transmitting an image and displaying it on a screen, you couldn't have art. If it just is a guy watching the screen, there's no art. The reason art works is because there are so many areas doing different specialized, processing different aspects of the visual image and talking to each other. So what the artist is doing is creating images. So let's get rid of realism, right? What he's doing is distorting and creating images which more optimally titillate these visual areas in the brain than you could with a realistic image. So that's what the artist is doing. He's creating hyper stimuli. And the question is, how do you distort the image? You can't take an image and to stimulate these areas more effectively and create a limbic jolt, you can't arbitrarily, randomly distort them and call it art. Although here in La Jolla, people do that, okay? So the question is, how do you create lawful distortions, right? So what I'm going to do is, again, tell you about some elementary principles. The first one, simple one, is grouping. And you all have the experience of seeing this set of splotches. How many of you have seen this before? Raise your hand. Well, those who have not, you see a bunch of splotches, and as you watch, I'm telling you, there's a dog here, and slowly you start, there's a Dalmatian dog, these are the legs, these are the front legs, paws, and then that's the ear, and it's sniffing the ground, that's the collar. How many of you see it now? And notice you can actually sense your visual system groping for a solution as though it's solving a problem, and finally when it clicks, you go, aha. Now this is a well-known illusion. What people have not commented on adequately is you get a reward jolt when you finally see the image. So it's almost like problem solving and an internal reward when you solve the visual problem of finding this Dalmatian dog. Now let's take another example of grouping in our context. You go to Nordstrom's and you go and buy a skirt or a scarf or a jacket or a tie, and the salesman will say, oh, when you have the tie, you should have some blue flecks in it if you're wearing a blue jacket, because it'll pick it up and it'll look prettier. Now why the hell does he say that? Is this just arbitrary, is it just hype, marketing? What is it? Well, I'm going to argue no, it's telling you something very deep about aesthetics, and it's really tapping into brain circuitry involved in detecting camouflage, believe it or not. So imagine one of your ancestor primates scurrying up on the treetops, seeing something, a leopard with a bunch of splotches, and it's completely camouflaged. As soon as the leopard starts moving, you see all the splotches moving in one direction, and the brain instantly says, what is the likelihood they're all moving together in the same direction by chance? No, they're all one object. Let me glue them together, and oh, wow, it's a leopard. Let me get out of here. Okay? Now, that jolt, wow jolt, is absolutely critical. So little, and same thing, you can have color. You've seen through green foliage and you see some yellow splotches and you say, what the hell is that? And the brain says it can't be a coincidence that all these yellow splotches, you link them together and you say, my God, it's a lion, let me get out of here. And let me show you some examples of this. So that's an example of movement. The leopard I was telling you about, but in this case it's not a leopard. What do you see? Okay, face. So, and then you get an aesthetic jolt. Now that's an example of yellow splotches seen behind green foliage. And you see, that's a bird. And the brain is groping for a solution. When it clicks, it gets an aha aesthetic jolt. And so little does this salesman in Nordstrom's realize, when he's picking a tie with similar blue specks to your coat, he's tapping into the same neural circuitry that evolved in your brains to detect lions. Okay? So that's the same circuitry he's tapping into. Now, let's go on a little bit. Now, for any one of these laws, so okay, so speaking of the aha experience, what I'd like to suggest is when you're looking at complex visual images of the kind some artists produce to create aesthetic appeal, what happens is the old view of vision comes from MIT, is there's a module here in the visual cortex, and then there's another module, another module, another module, and then finally you say, wow, it's an object, it's a lion, right? So it's a serial hierarchical bucket brigade model of vision, which Pat and I have criticized in the old days and Terry Sinofsky. In fact, real vision does not proceed in this manner. At every stage in the hierarchy of processing, first of all, there's a lot of parallel processing, but every stage in the hierarchy, a partial solution to the visual problem is sent back to the earlier stage to bias subsequent processing. And this seems to happen at every stage. So you get little ahas at every stage in processing. And what I'm going to claim later is that each stage, when you achieve a partial solution, a mini aha is generated when a jolt is sent to the limbic structures, especially the amygdala. And we know that the amygdala sends connections all the way back to every stage almost in visual processing. That's not a hypothesis, that's known anatomically. Okay? And I think the role of these pathways in visual art and aesthetics has not been adequately appreciated. Okay, so let's move on. Grouping is also used by Renaissance artists and indeed by most schools of art. Here's an example where this azure of this clothes mimics the azure of the sky. You get the same beige color repeating. Obviously, I don't think this is because he had a limited palette of colors. It's because he's exploiting this desire of the visual system to group similar colors. In this case, of course, this backfires because normally grouping is for fragments of the same object. But that rule is built in so you can take advantage of it and say, let's create it, even though it's different objects, it doesn't matter, the rule is pleasing to the eye. And I can show you other examples of that, like that one from Duchamp. Sorry, Matisse. Sorry, Duchamp, whatever. Okay, well, anyhow, another example of a law, a simple law, is symmetry. We alluded to this earlier, many speakers alluded to this. Why is symmetry appealing? And I think it's universal. I think even animals have this preference for symmetry. And one theory is something to do with detecting parasites, but we won't go there. The reason I think is in nature, most biological objects are symmetrical. It's either prey or predator or mate. So there's an early alert system saying, something symmetrical here, look at it, it's interesting, and it grabs your attention. Maybe it's a potential prey, potential mate, maybe it's a predator, then get out of it, so it's arousing. And that's what you're tapping into, whether you're looking at a butterfly or something like a human face, or even the immortal monumental love that we call the Taj Mahal. Now, of course, great monuments, there's no point in having them symmetrical, but they're again tapping into the same neural machinery that evolved to detect people, to detect animals and detect prey and predator. The great king is tapping into that same principle and creating this great symmetrical architecture. Okay, then I'd like to tell you about another principle, which is called peak shift. It comes from animal behavior. One of the things I want to emphasize is in coming up with these principles of visual aesthetics, you need to do three things, three corners of a triangle. And that is, first, you need to, so what I call it is what, how, and why. Okay? By what, I mean, what is the law? Give a clear formulation of the particular principle you're talking about, like grouping, or symmetry, or peak shift. And then you say, why? Why is this useful? Why is it useful to group things? And I told you it's to defeat camouflage. Why is it used to detect symmetry? And I said it's to do with living things. That can't be right. Okay. So, and then you need to know how, what the neural circuitry is. So let's take another example of what I call peak shift. You teach an animal to discriminate a square and a rectangle, and the animal, you teach a rectangle is just a rat, the rectangle, square means no food, rectangle means piece of cheese. it soon learns to distinguish a rectangle from a square. Now you then present to the rat something it's never seen before, a longer, skinnier rectangle, and the rat prefers number 3 to number 2. And you say, well, that's stupid. Why would it actually prefer the third rectangle to the second rectangle? Because it was originally shown that. The answer is it's not really stupid, because what the rat is learning is a rule, rectangularity. Okay? And this is, so the more rectangular, the better. So it says, wow, what a sexy rectangle. And it goes to that. Okay? So this is called a peak shift. And you say, what's it got to do with art? Well, if you do this in human caricature, you do the same thing. If I say create a caricature of Nixon, you take Nixon, his big nose, shaggy eyebrows, subtract it from the average male face, and you get what's characteristic of Nixon, and you amplify it, and you get a peak shift version of Nixon, and you say, my God, it looks even more like Nixon than Nixon himself. Now, that's caricature if you overdo it, but you can do the same thing with great portraiture, which is what Rembrandt did. By the way, I want to pause here for a second and tell you a little bit about the neuroscientific aspects of this. Many people have gone and recorded from the brains of primates, including brain imaging in humans. You put an electrode in MT, middle temporal area, which is sensitive to direction of motion, and then say, I'm going to show you a Calder-mobile, which is a great work of kinetic art. And the cell in MT starts firing. And you say, my God, I've discovered the basis of kinetic art. Now, that's complete bullshit, because that cell will fire with any movement. It's nothing to do with an artistic ability. A swarm of bees will set the cell firing. So what you have to show is, again, if you go to phase cells in the fusiform gyrus, if you show a Rembrandt, it'll fire, and you say, my God, I've discovered the basis of portraiture. But if you show it any damn face, it'll fire, right? So what you have to show is what's special about a Rembrandt face that makes it different from a regular photograph. In other words, what I think he's doing peak shifts. So what I'm predicting is, if you show caricatures of an alpha male primate to the cell, that'll be more effective than the original prototype. And this has actually been, we proposed this 10 years ago, it's actually been confirmed experimentally by a couple of different groups working at Harvard. Okay, now you say, what's this got to do with, okay, that's caricature, but the same principle applies to Indian art, or any art for that matter. So that looks maybe a little bit distorted, but what you do is you take the average woman subtracted from, you take a beautiful woman, you take a woman and subtract the male from the female, and you say, what's woman-like about her? And then you exaggerate it, and of course you're going to get big breasts, big hips, and all of that. And also posture, it's not just big breasts and hips. The posture that a female can adopt, there are certain postures that I can't do as a male, even if I tried, okay? It's to do with the angle between the femoral shaft and the neck, and the pelvis and all of that, and the woman can do this effortlessly. So you go into posture space, and you amplify it, and you get this beautiful, elegant, triple flexion poise. Another example of that. Another example. Okay, so I'm going to skip that. I was going to tell you about Picasso cells and how you can get into that. Maybe we can talk about that later tomorrow. Now you say, well, that's fine about facial portraiture and caricature and all of that. What about abstract art? Right? What about Henry Moore, for example, or even a Picasso, for that matter? Well, here you go to ethology. So that's a seagull with a big beak, yellow beak with a red spot, and when the chick hatches from the egg, it starts pecking at that red spot, and the mother then regurgitates the food, half-digested food, into the gaping mouth of the chick. The chick swallows it, and it's happy. So the question Timbergen asked is, how does the chick know its mother? And he said, what he found was, you don't need a mother. You pluck the beak off, presumably from a dead seagull, right? And then you wave it in front of the chick, and the chick still goes for the beak. And you say, well, that's stupid. Why is the chick begging for food from a disembodied beak waved about by the scientist? Well, the answer is not stupid, because the visual system is trying to do as little work as possible for the job on hand. And here it's saying, what is the likelihood of my seeing a disembodied beak in nature? It's almost certainly attached to my mother. So let me just simplify all the computation and just go for that long thing with the red spot, because I'm unlikely to ever encounter a mutant pig with a beak in nature. Okay? Now, the amazing thing Timbergen found, though, was you don't need a beak. You can take a stick and you put 3 red stripes. The chick fetishizes it. It prefers this to the beak. It goes berserk. And it actually prefers it to the mother and starts pecking at that. And you say, well, that's kind of stupid. Why does it do that? Well, this suggests that there are neurons in the tectum and other visual areas in the chick's brain. There are some form prototypes or form primitives. We don't know what the coding scheme is in vision in these brains yet. But let's assume that it has some coding scheme, like more outline red, the better. Therefore, what you're doing is by putting 3 stripes, you're producing a super beak, right? So it's even more beak-like than the real beak, and the chick goes crazy and he says, my God, what a beak, right? Now, what's this got to do with art? So this is my punchline. What I'm going to say is that if the seagulls had an art gallery, they would hang this damn thing up on the wall, they would worship it, pay millions of dollars, and say, my God, why is it pleasing? It doesn't even look like anything like a real thing. Well, that's what all of you are doing when you're buying works of abstract art, okay? You're all behaving like seagull chicks. And, you know, I can give you examples, but I won't. This is nothing realistic about it, but it's tapping into some form primitives in your brain. I was going to tell you about Picasso. I'm going to skip that. Let me tell you about one or two more principles. I did start about 10 minutes late. I just want to... Okay. Now, I talked about peak shift. Now, on the other hand, there's another principle which is called isolation. That is, every artist knows this, and that is the art of understatement. Sometimes a little doodle by Picasso of a bull, I'm sure many of you have seen this, or Klimt, we usually think of paintings, but sometimes he drew little nudes with just an outline, which is nothing but a little outline, and it's wonderfully evocative and beautiful. So here, less is more in art, as the aphorism goes. So am I not contradicting myself? On the one hand, I'm saying peak shift, exaggeration, hyperbole. On the other hand, I'm saying minimalism, understatement. So is this not a contradiction? Oops. So is this not a contradiction? Well, often science progresses by resolving contradiction. I claim it's not a contradiction, because the reason is when you see a full color 3D picture of a nude, you've got all kinds of irrelevant information cluttering the image. This has nothing to do with their outline or form. And your brain, even though it's got 100 billion nerve cells, have a limited attentional capacity. You can have only one set of neurons active at any given time representing an object in the visual world. Given that attentional bottleneck, if you clutter the image of all sorts of irrelevant, see, my skin color is the same as a nude, my hair is the same as a nude. What's special about her is her outline, or a bull for that matter. What's special is about her outline. So what an artist, when we learn to sketch, for example, we have to learn to focus on what's critical about the nude, namely the outline, right? And put all our attention to it and introduce peak shifts in that. And what you and I do through extensive training, the intuitive genius or artist does spontaneously. He focuses his attention on what's critical, and he throws away all the irrelevant clutter. This is why a nude which is made of an outline is much more evocative than a Playboy pinup or a Chippendale pinup with all the 3D information and all the color. And a good example, you say, how do I know this, Rama? Well, a good example is this. I'm showing you three pictures, one drawn by a normal 8-year-old child. And it looks absolutely hideous. I mean, you might want to call it abstract art. To me, it looks hideous, okay? Now, on the other hand, you come here, you see this is a work of art by the great Renaissance artist, Leonardo da Vinci. And you can see it's much more pleasing aesthetically. Everybody would agree. Now, here is a work of art done by a 7-year-old autistic child who can barely talk, in fact, can't talk. And this is Nadia. And many people, when I don't tell them this, will say, this is actually more pretty than this. It's more animated. It has more movement, more energy. So how can a 7-year-old retarded child, quote-unquote retarded child, produce a more beautiful drawing than Leonardo da Vinci? The answer is, again, the principle of isolation, what I was telling you about earlier, which is that in the autistic child, even though many of the modules are malfunctioning, there may be one region of the brain, this is perfectly testable, namely the right parietal, which is involved in the sense of artistic proportion. We know this from clinical neurology. And that area, you can allocate all your attentional resources spontaneously to the one remaining functional module, so they can extract what's essential about the image much more effectively than you and I can, and discard all the irrelevant clutter, hence the phenomenon of savant syndrome, or idiot savant as they used to be called. Okay. One more principle and we're done, or two more principles, and that is the principle of visual problem solving. And that is sometimes seeing a Playboy pinup or a Chippendale pinup is much less aesthetically appealing than seeing a nude behind a shower curtain. And you say, well, that's kind of weird. After all, there's more information coming from a pinup and hitting all your visual areas in the brain than from something hidden behind a shower curtain. Here, what I'd like to submit is that the very act of searching for meaning, searching for an image there, and saying, aha, it's an object, is pleasing to the eye. Just as when you, in regular problem solving, you're playing chess or doing a jigsaw puzzle, when you finally put it together, you say, aha, I found the object. So what I'm claiming is, at each stage in visual processing, so here is it's sort of understated, subdued, and the brain is faced with a challenge, it's actually more pleasing to the eye, just as playing chess is playing, regular problem solving is pleasing to the eye. And again, harking back to what I said earlier, that what's going on in vision is at every stage there's a mini aha jolt. Otherwise, if you were to see a woman or a man in a fog, you would give up the chase immediately instead of pursuing her. So this makes the pursuit in itself rewarding or reinforcing. And I'm claiming that this is going from the visual areas in the brain back to the limbic structures and sent back saying, pursue further, okay? And these are all testable conjectures. Now, there's another example there. So what I'm arguing then essentially is visual art and aesthetics is visual foreplay before the climax of object recognition, okay? So just as foreplay can be annoying, but at the same time extremely delightful and pleasing, same thing is going on in visual art, okay? All right, so that's, again, showing you the visual pathways. I'm going to tell you about one principle, which is abhorrence of unique visual vantage points, but I'll just skip over it briefly. That image is far less pleasing than that image. And you say, why? Because that's just as likely to be around. I mean, just in terms of probability, that's just as probable as that. Why is that hideous and why is that prettier? Because the brain has a built-in tendency to prefer generic viewpoints and doesn't like unique viewpoints. And we can go into that later in discussion. And it shows, by the way, something utterly trivial. Why are beauty spots beautiful? She's pretty and that beauty spot. By the way, we've done quantitative studies on that and obtained what psychologists refer to as psychometric functions, which means graph, essentially, okay? We've done that. But the bottom line is that looks pretty, that looks hideous. And you don't need a graph. You don't need a psychometric function to show that, okay? That, again, looks hideous. Now, why that is so is not clear. That's actually symmetrical, so it should be prettier because I think that's a unique vantage point. But that's a generic vantage point, but also it's drawing attention to important features. If you cannot answer something as simple as why are beauty spots beautiful and why the positioning makes such an enormous difference to its aesthetic appeal, you've not begun to scratch the surface of the problem of what aesthetics is. I wanted to tell you about metaphor in art. A couple of speakers already alluded to it. And I think this aspect of art is art. It's uniquely human. And there are many layers of meaning in this work of art, which time does not permit. I can talk about this for an hour, but I won't. But now I'm going to conclude by saying, here, throwing up a challenge. We've talked about all these principles of aesthetics. Have we solved the problem of aesthetics? The answer is we've made a beginning. Have we solved the problem of art? We've barely scratched the surface. The challenge is, why do we think, I'm going to show you two examples of art. One of them is absolutely hideous. It's kitsch. And the other is a work of art. Now, is this just arbitrary and cultural? I think that's nonsense. I think there's a genuine difference between kitsch art and the real thing, because you can graduate from kitsch to the real thing, but you can't slide backwards. And to give you an example of this, that's a great work of art. It's a Monet, as you all know. That's the 0 point of art. It's Kincaid, and I don't want to offend anybody here who collects Kincaids, okay? So now kitsch also has some of these principles. So what's the difference? What I would argue is that kitsch goes through the appearance of deploying these principles, does so ineffectively, because they haven't quite grasped the principles. So they ineffectively use the same principles and blindly follow them, and you end up with kitsch art. I'm sort of planning an experiment where I show lots of people non-kitsch works of art, and then subtract from the brain image kitsch works of art and see what lights up, and you get the art center in the brain. Thank you.